Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, managing editor for Bloomberg Opinion, and we're talking this morning about all of this week's nominees for Trump's cabinet and how their Senate hearings went and what we might pick up about what this means for Trump's second term, which starts officially on Monday, although it feels like it's been already kind of going on for a while now. He's really dominated the conversation since his November election. First, we're going to talk about Scott Bessent. But before we get to the Treasury Secretary nominee, Nia, I wanted to check in with you. You're a politics columnist based in Washington. What was sort of your key takeaway from the week of hearings? Like, give us the context. What's the big picture?
I think I am struck by how different this version of Trump is versus the Trump of 2016 going into his first term. First term, Donald Trump was in some ways the accidental president, right? And so he needed the cabinet to legitimize him. So he brought in people of stature who were titans in their own right. You think about somebody like Rex Tillerson at State, John Kelly. You remember him talking about his generals. And if you move forward to now, he doesn't need that. He can bring in people who are his people in some ways he has created. You think particularly about somebody like Pete Hegseth, who is not anywhere near being a general, had been a former Fox News host. And so he is a much more confident president. He is a much more powerful president. I think in so many ways he's at the apex of his power. And with that, he can pick whoever he wants, whether or not people think these folks are qualified or not. And he can bend the Senate to his will to make them go along with these, in some ways, unorthodox picks. There is a spectrum of people. There are some people who are perfectly legitimate picks. Marco Rubio comes to mind as Secretary of State. But then there are others in the mix. Pete Hegseth, folks like Tulsi Gabbard, who will have her hearing much later. And so that is what has struck me about this week, how different this version of Trump and MAGA is than what we saw in 2016.
That's a good point. And I think some have noticed or suggested this time that the picks are not as qualified as his first term picks. There seems to be much more of a loyalty test, perhaps with the exception of his economic picks.
Yeah.
So that's a dichotomy that has really struck a lot of people. And I feel like that's a good segue, Jonathan, to bring in you as our economics columnist. And you can tell us, like, what was your sort of big takeaway from this very closely watched hearing for the Treasury position this week?
Yeah, excellent framing from Nia, and to your point, Bessent really is an exception to the rule. I think the Trump team understands that it's a delicate time in the global economy, and they needed to put somebody in there who was not going to ruffle feathers in Wall Street. And Scott Bessent very much, fits the bill. He's a guy with a long history in investing. He worked with Stanley Druckenmiller. He worked with George Soros. And, my first big takeaway is, the guy comes forward with two big priorities. And the combination of the two priorities is extremely, extremely bizarre. He says, on the one hand, that he is committed to this sort of generational challenge of tackling the deficit and the national debt. And I think that's a very good priority. I mean, he is absolutely spot on this. We're on an unsustainable path, and something needs to happen, hopefully over the next 4 years, to get us back on a sustainable path. His second big priority that he talks about, though, is cutting taxes. And he also portrays that as a sort of existential challenge. And I disagree with that. This economy does not really need tax cuts. But B, the combination of these two things, I want to reduce deficits and we must cut taxes, simply makes no sense.
Yes, it's very hard to see how those can coexist in the current environment. I have a sort of a novice's sort of question for you, because I hear for 30 years, I have heard people talk about the deficit and how it's a big problem. And yet now people seem to be saying, well, that's true, but now it's like a real problem. So can you just frame for us a little bit, like, why, when we've had concerns about the deficit for so long, it's now like bubbling up to a new level of concern?
Yeah, well, there's a psychological element of this, and a lot of it plays out in bond yields and ultimately interest costs, right? You can get away with a lot. You can paper over a lot in terms of primary deficits when interest costs are very, very low. But when interest costs are high, like they are now, suddenly it becomes a problem. And you can see how, as people start to think and worry about deficits more and more, those interest costs keep creeping higher and higher, and it becomes a sort of snowball situation. And it's that sort of doom loop that we really need officials to stop dead in its tracks right here and now. It's a top priority for the next 4 years, and a lot of the near term solution is just going to come from saying the right things, returning confidence to our financial markets, and taking sort of laying out at least the beginning of a sustainable strategy.
Okay.
Is it your sense? I mean, if you talk to voters going into the election, people talked about the price of groceries, price of eggs. Trump himself would go on and on about the price of bacon, which I love. Is it your sense that there is a plan in place and a vision for actually lowering prices? The other is housing affordability. Are people going to be able to get out of their starter homes and move up to those bigger homes to sort of have their own version of the American dream?
No, Nia, there's no plan, zero plan. I mean, so my impression is, in general, I've been kind of an inflation optimist. And I think that there is a possibility that if the Trump team chooses not to shoot themselves in the foot here with new policies that exacerbate the problem, they may actually be the beneficiaries of a longer run trend that was already in place for inflation to sort of converge on the 2% target, maybe in the back half of 2025 or early 2026. But there are a lot of ways that we could shoot ourselves in the foot here. Tariffs is the big one. It is true that some of the hand wringing is a little bit exaggerated. I don't think that in a likely tariff scenario that would cause inflation to shoot back up into the 6 or 7% range. No, but tariffs could absolutely prevent us from getting back to where we want to go. They could, keep inflation in sort of the 3% range. If Trump were to take things to an extreme scenario, you could move back into the fours, something like that. And one thing that I just worry a lot about is our inflationary psychology. A lot of the theory around inflation these days posits that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. When consumers and businesses come to believe that there's going to be inflation in the future, they start to front run purchases. They start to demand raises from their bosses. And these are the kind of psychological things that keep inflation around. Again, they might not cause inflation to surge back to 6 or 7 or 8%, but it tends to keep inflation around. And that's exactly what we don't want when we're sort of in the last mile of the inflation battle.
Mm-hmm. And, I think during the hearing, Besant did get a question about prices and how he would handle any policies that might further increase prices. We have a clip of that, so let's take a look.
If the president-elect were to propose a policy that you believe will increase prices, would you advise against it?
I would speak to President Trump about it. It is his decision, and I believe that we think that if we look back, that it is a complete composite return in terms of aggregate inflation numbers, and I think it's very difficult.
Well, I have limited time, so if you believe that a policy that is proposed by President Trump would increase prices, would you advise him against doing it? Yes or no?
I can't answer that question because it's a hypothetical.
You told me that President Biden was responsible for increased prices over the past 4 years. By the same token, I assume you would agree that if prices increase in the next 4 years, President-elect Trump would be responsible.
I think there could be a variety of reasons.
So, Jonathan, tell us what you found interesting there.
Yeah, strictly hypothetical, right? No, it's not hypothetical, Mr. Besant. A key part of President-elect Trump's economic platform is he wants to do tariffs, and we can play with language all you want, but it is just economic orthodoxy that if we do this, it's going to raise the price level on a number of products. You know, the sort of backers of Trump's agenda here will say that you can't think of tariffs just in terms of inflation. People will say, well, you got to think about the national security elements. You got to think about how we could potentially restructure the American economy and bring manufacturing jobs back. Fine, that's another conversation to have at another time. But if we're just talking about prices, this is pretty black and white. It's going to have an impact, and in my view, it's going to have an impact at the worst possible time for the inflation battle.
Something else that struck me about that exchange was the extent to which Besant really deferred to the president. I said, oh, that's a hypothetical. I'd have to talk about it with the president. That came up in a number of the different hearings. Probably the king of that was Vogt, the nominee for Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vogt. He said it so often, I thought, why are we even having this hearing? Oh, that's a hypothetical. I'd have to talk about it with the president. The Office of Management Budget is sometimes called the most powerful department you've never heard of, right? So it's a key role. And Nia, I'm just sort of wondering, gut check from you, is that kind of dodge normal in these hearings? Or are you seeing an unusual level of deference to, well, I'd have to talk about it with the president? Is there sort of an unusual amount of deferring there to Trump?
I do think there is an unusual amount of deferring and an unusual amount of hyper partisanship as well, dumping on whether it was Obama or Biden, obviously, but people sort of going back even to Obama to dump on prior Democratic presidents. So that did also strike me. But again, there is this, and you talked about it, there is this litmus test. Not only is there an audience of one in terms of wanting to stay in Trump's good graces, but there is, for some of these other folks, very specific litmus tests around who won the election in 2020, and was January 6th an insurrection or just a walk in the park. And so you see some of that. But again, I think some of this goes back to a lot of these picks, and I think the economic team does not fall under this category. A lot of these picks being folks who owe their opportunity to be in these positions solely to Donald Trump. And so you see a level of deference, I think, there in these hearings that is a preview. I think Democrats fear, and a lot of Americans fear, a preview of what you might see when these folks get into these positions, that they won't stand up to Donald Trump, that they won't be a kind of a guardrail in the way that we saw in the previous Trump administration.
Thank you. We'll have to switch gears shortly to talk more about the national security nominees. But Jonathan, before we let you go, I'm just wondering, is there anything that you're looking for next week as more nominees come forward, or anything you'll be watching from Trump's economic team to kind of tell you which way they're leaning on some of the issues you raised?
One key point that I just wanted to underscore that didn't really come up in the Besant hearing is just what's going to happen with bond issuance. And I understand why it didn't come up. It's pretty wonky for even for the Senate Financial Committee, but I think it could ultimately be one of the most important things that plays out in year one of the Trump administration. Besant himself was extremely critical of the fact that Janet Yellen did a lot of bond issuance at the short end of the Treasury curve. And in making that criticism, he insinuated that he, would want to do more issuance at the long curve. But what is the consequence if he comes out and actually says that? That would drive up yields in 10-year Treasury notes, which would also push up borrowing costs for things like 30-year mortgages. And I think that borrowing costs, especially in that mortgage space, in auto loans, is going to be absolutely fundamental for the level of perceived success of this administration, especially in year one.
Thank you, Jonathan. And as we conclude this segment, we'll say goodbye to you and bring on our foreign policy columnist, Andreas Kluth, and shift gears slightly to talk about some of Trump's more unusual nominees. Andreas, you watched the Pete Hegseth ruling very closely, as did Nia. You both picked up on how Democrats really brought home the point that he is not qualified. I think a review of one journalist looked at all of the qualifications for all of the secretaries of war, as they used to be called, back to George Washington, found Hegseth has the thinnest resume by far. Andreas, what struck you about that? Why at this moment would Trump nominate someone who has such a thin background here?
What struck me was what one senator near the end said, Blumenthal, Connecticut Democrat, as I don't doubt that you're a great communicator, just you have absolutely no qualifications, and there's no way you can convince the American people that you have qualifications. And in a way, he could have said that to Donald Trump, but he happened to say it to Hegseth. And so Hegseth, in that way, is the perfect Trump pick. Trump fell in love with him because he saw him on Fox TV. He was an anchor. It was 100% showmanship. It's starting with his sartorial message. He came dressed in a suit, shirt, tie that was an American flag. And then on top of it had American flags sticking out of here on his belt buckle and his socks, just in case I wasn't subtle enough. Some of the tattoos picking out. And then Hegseth's entire spiel was to paint all this, voluminous amount of reporting on accusations of sexual misconduct, all the character questions, alcohol abuse, financial mismanagement, as a smear campaign. And because he has this audience of one, namely Trump, said, this was the libs smearing us. This is all the more hurtful because they've done it to Trump. And sort of like, this is really about Trump. And so we are the victims of this campaign. And the Democrats tried, I think unsuccessfully, to turn it into a referendum on his qualifications. There were a number of there was relative to previous confirmation hearings of secretaries of defense, there was almost, scant attention paid to questions of geopolitics. Now, I noticed, for instance, there was an exchange. I happen to be very interested in nuclear policy. So he was able, I was grateful that he was able to name the three parts, the three legs of the nuclear triad. Later, Senator Ducksworth asked him, it came up in context, could you name a country in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 countries, some of them quite important. And he named 3 countries, and they happened to be not members of ASEAN and not even in Southeast Asia. And then Ducksworth said, well, you need to do your homework. So whether you make it competence or character, that's what Blumenthal was saying, he's not qualified.
Yeah.
Trump really doesn't care a whit about either. He loves the showmanship, and that's what this is a contrast to Senator Rubio, which I think you'll ask me about. But showmanship is what Trump wants. He also wants a culture war, because Hegseth kept talking about lethality and a warrior ethos, but he made it clear, or it became clear, both in his books and on Fox, what he said there, and today, that he wants this warrior ethos to be about a hyper-masculine warrior ethos aimed inward at our culture wars, as much as, or maybe more than outward at adversaries. The adversaries came up like China, but they didn't play a big role in this hearing.
I'm gonna bring Nia in here because she also had pointed out that some issues around the Hegseth hearing. I think you're right, Andreas. There was a huge focus on what Trump would call the enemy within, and not so much a focus on the enemies or foes or opponents without. Nia, you also closely watched this hearing, and you pointed out that for all that Hegseth talked about standards for troops, he really didn't live up to those standards himself. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there was so much talk of standards, of meritocracy, and this assumption that it was sort of a woke mob that had lowered the standards. And the picture of the woke mob really is women, right? That, you know, they can't really carry their rucksacks. One of the senators, I think it was Tom Cotton, talked about sort of the physicality differences between men and women and what that might mean on the battlefield. And as Andreas alludes to, there was this both explicit and implicit argument about masculinity. One of the senators near the end asked him, how many push-ups did you do this morning? And I think he said 5 sets of 47. I don't know if he chose 47 because Trump is the 47th president, perhaps. But that is what it was about. And to the extent that he's qualified to do anything, he is certainly qualified, I think, to just purge the place of all of these people that are perceived to be too liberal, too woke, as enemies of Donald Trump. And he got into that near the end, that there's going to be this huge review, and all of the senior folks in the Pentagon and the leadership class, they will go under a review. And I think we know what that review is about. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look again at his resume, he kept talking about himself as the guy with dust on his boots, vis-a-vis sort of the pencil necks in air-conditioned offices, who presumably can't do 47 push-ups, 5 sets, mind you, in the morning. I fully expect that he will get confirmed, and at some point we'll see him doing a PT with folks, in different bases around the country, because that is what it's about, this idea of a return, this sort of lost masculinity, this lost status, particularly among, I think, working class white men, that he is there to restore.
Yes, it was interesting. One of the contrasts that stood out to me was the repeated discussion of female weakness by so many of the male senators, even as the female senators showed a level of ferocity that I think far outshone any of the questioning. I mean, Hegseth got kind of lackadaisical, lean back, chill questioning from a lot of the men, but the women were like, lean in, I'm coming for you. Mm-hmm. So I think the tip of that spear was Tammy Duckworth in some ways. So we have a great clip from her leaning into him. So let's take a look at that now.
How can we ask these warriors to train and perform the absolute highest standards when you are asking us to lower the standards to make you the Secretary of Defense simply because you are buddies with our president-elect? You can't seem to grasp that there is no U.S. military as we know it without the incredible women that we serve. Women who've earned their place in their units. You have not earned your place as Secretary of Defense. You say you care about keeping our armed forces strong and that you like that our armed forces are meritocracy. Then let's not lower the standards for you. You, sir, are a no-go at this station.
So she really, I think that encapsulates a lot of the Democratic attacks on Hegseth. They really did focus on the lack of qualifications. Were either of you surprised that Republicans are not more bothered by this? I mean, I can see why Democrats didn't lean into the character stuff. That has not really worked for them, trying to block other people Trump has nominated, notably Brett Kavanaugh, it hasn't worked. So I understand why they would switch tactics. But I am surprised there aren't more hawkish Republicans who are concerned that Hegseth simply is not up to leading a massive military with a massive budget.
You ask if Nia and I are surprised. I'm not surprised, because this is the whole thing. This is part of the loyalty test. So Tom Cotton was, that could be expected which side he would take. But Chairman Wicker started off by essentially, like when Hegseth was first announced, there were critical voices, but it's become clear that, this has become a loyalty test for are you with or against Trump? And then you have to buy into the narrative. So even Chairman Wicker teed it up by giving the metaphor which Hegseth then used, that all of this is a virtue, not a vice. You see, he has dust on his boots.
Yeah.
So Hegseth has dust on his boots. He was not a grunt, but he was between grunt but not brass. He was in Middle East, in Guantanamo. He knows what it's like. Very questionable record, by the way, because he defended soldiers who were turned in by other soldiers for alleged war crimes. But so, and it's also offensive because, for instance, on Monday, I was in an interview with General Mattis, one of his predecessors. These people have been in dusty places with boots. They have dust on their boots. Okay, so
Yes.
but also that is not the qualification you want. Just if you step back for a second, what is a Secretary of Defense? It is like, not officially like the Secretary of State, but it is one of America's chief diplomats. You're herding cats among allies. If I think of how Lloyd Austin has been coordinating the 50 countries in the Ukraine contact group, the Ramstein group, to try to organize that. Can Hegseth do that? This is a lot more than about walking around with boots in the dust. But the Republicans, realizing that this is the theme I tried to set up, is that this is about showmanship, and Hegseth completely grasped that and is perfect for that role. It went along with that and said, well, no, all of this is good. Finally, we get someone who has dusty boots, and you're going to sort them out. I think, and that's it, the whole thing is a kind of kabuki. That's too Japanese. Let's find something else. But it is a form of theater. And therefore, it was more interesting to me is how would the Democrats come back? Would they be effective at puncturing that? Unfortunately, I think they haven't been, which is why, as Nia said, he will get confirmed.
Yeah, I think you're right that they made a virtue of his inexperience. Nia, in your column, you pointed out that their defense of him was sort of odd. It was like, look, he doesn't need skills to do this job. He'll have a staff around him. The only qualification is that he's a civilian.
Yeah.
We can keep this brief because I know we need to move on to other nominees. But can you imagine a female nominee?
Yeah, absolutely not.
In that way? Okay.
You can't imagine a female who apparently, if you listen to what Hegseth was saying, they're sort of automatically unqualified. God forbid if they're a mom. And so, no, you can't imagine a woman, a person of color, a gay person, anyone but a white male who is able to go with such a thin resume and convince them by virtue of a few phrases, right? And name dropping Jesus and name dropping his wife and referencing the dust on his boots. He has been mediocre at all of his jobs, right? I mean,
at best.
And so that, I think, is why you saw, I think, real anger from a lot of the Democrats. They were kind of righteous indignation and disbelief that this person who is just not qualified is going to lead 3 million people and oversee a budget of almost $1 trillion. So it is. And to have people in Trump circles say, "Oh, it'll be fine," that's what staff is for. And so
that's what staff is for.
That's what staff is for. None of us would, if you're hiring a CEO of a company, and one of the senators pointed that out, this kind of record wouldn't fly. You wouldn't hire someone like this at all.
Yeah, that's a good opportunity to pivot to maybe one of Trump's best, or maybe even his single best, most qualified nominee, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. I think the big question with Rubio, and Andreas, you compared his hearing to like an Ivy League seminar in contrast to Hegseth's. The big question is he going to be able to stick around? Right? So what is your answer to that? Will we be seeing him in this role for longer than 6 months or a year?
Well, first of all, regarding the Ivy League seminar, the contrast, because they were on successive days, was incredible. And I have to tell you, if you're a national security geek, then Rubio's hearing was infinitely more interesting, right? So with Hegseth, you get the sort of Fox News showmanship, just soundbite culture, this deep. With Rubio, he is a senator, and he was on that committee. He was actually on the other side interviewing his predecessors. And this was like they were very close to a group hug. Republicans, Democrats, all of them. They were this close to French kissing in there. And then, but they did it at this level of an Ivy League seminar where, and I mentioned this, he kept doing this. So at one point he was answering a question and he very casually mentioned that a few years ago, Kazakhstan co-hosted a ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization and then went into the implications of that. And I thought, Yes, Marco, you've got this one. But so in terms of depth, he's the opposite of Hegseth. The problem, as you just pointed out, is because he has depth, he's been around. It takes a long time to get this kind of expertise, and he has over the years taken stances, principled and logical, so based on either realist national interest or idealist principle, human rights, for instance, in China, that unfortunately are the diametric opposite of any instinct that Trump is displaying. So Rubio noticed this a while ago when he realized he might have a career here, and has done this very fascinating, sort of like an oil tanker, gradually turning and then more suddenly, more recently turning. But the problem is, we all know, because he's written it, said it, that on Ukraine and Russia, on trade, by the way, on Taiwan, on China, on some of these things, though not Latin America, he's the traditional Reagan hawk, believing in America needing to show moral leadership. He would have been called an interventionist in a lot of ways. And he now will have to defend not just the opposite of what he believes or used to believe, and what Trump believes, but will have to defend whatever Trump believes on any given day. Because remember, Trump's whole shtick is to be unpredictable, and the madman theory. And Rubio, this educated mind, will have to make that sound articulate. He did a great job doing that, but he can, if the audience is ultimately an audience of one, being Trump, he is exactly in that choice now. Will he even last? In Trump 1, there were several, and we don't know yet. He may want to have fewer this time, but Rubio now has a chance. And in another column, there is a history of diplomats in world history, even in Napoleonic France and Sergei Lavrov in Russia, who just are very good at going with whatever the boss wants. That is one way he can go. And then he will have to betray himself. But he may have, so what is his ultimate? Will he run for president one day? Or if he doesn't want to betray himself, will he either keep sounding too smart for because he makes Trump sound stupid, frankly, sounding too smart, or will he be principled at some point? Will he choose a hill to die on? Because then he will die on that hill that day, and then he'll be gone. So he may not last out, a year, or he may last and betray himself. There's no questions in this case about the qualifications. This is why he's the opposite of Hegseth. It's just a question of whether he'll have any influence intellectually with Trump.
That is the big question. Thank you, Andreas. Nia, before we conclude here, I'm wondering kind of, what are you looking for next week? And let me give you a little bit of sort of background about why I'm asking that question, because early when Trump named some of these people, maybe with the exception of Rubio, Burgum, who also had a hearing this week, there was a lot of concern that a bunch of these people would not get through. Right. But the only one really who has pulled out so far is Matt Gaetz, replaced by Pam Bondi, who also had her hearing this week. Everyone seems on a glide path. So, are you watching for anything as future hearings come up? Or does it just kind of seem to you like everything's in the bag? We can all just move on.
Listen, I think everything is in the bag, and you look at Joni Ernst from the Pete Hegseth committee hearing. She seemed to be wavering early on, and then the MAGA mob came after her locally in Iowa, which is the state she represents, and online as well. There is a real threat, not just from a primary challenge, but a real threat of violence, right? I mean, MAGA is still the movement of January 6th, and so if you are one of these senators, you are undergoing a loyalty test too. Are you going to back Donald Trump, or are you going to risk your career and risk the ire of MAGA and go against him? And I get it. I get why, if you're somebody like Joni Ernst, why it would be hard to stand up to Donald Trump in the mob that backs him. And so with that background, I think these folks are going to go along. I think all of these people are going to get confirmed. You think about Tulsi Gabbard, who's coming ahead, RFK Jr., as well, and Kash Patel, who came up a bunch in the Pam Bondi hearing. They are not qualified. A lot of these folks are dangerous, conspiracy theorists and kooks as well, who pose a real threat both globally and domestically. But they, I think, will get confirmed. And part of the subtext of this, too, is we talked about Rubio in this context. A lot of these folks are also thinking about who inherits the MAGA movement once Trump moves on. Who among these people is going to run for president in 2028? I imagine Rubio thinks that he could be somebody standing on a debate stage, even somebody like Pete Hegseth, if he lasts, and maybe even if he doesn't last. Because he has the ear of Trump, and is certainly in sort of an embodiment of sort of all of this MAGA victimhood and manhood combined. And so that's one of the things you look for too, like where is this going, how Trump is putting his people in place to carry this movement forward.
Smart. Well, thank you both for joining us today. Thanks to Jonathan, who we had on earlier, and thanks to all of you for watching. We will see you again soon.